Up next at GroupBy here, we've got Martin Perez talking about T-SQL tools to synchronize changes. So take it away, sir.
Thank you. My name is Martin Perez. I'm a SQL Server DBA in Austin, Texas. There's a lot of text and slides, and towards the end we will fire up SSMS and kind of look at some of these things. And any questions or comments, I welcome them. Let's get the conversation going. So we were talking earlier about what sort of things do you just live with as a DBA, whether you're a developer or kind of a hybrid. Sometimes you're the one-stop shop for everything data related. Sometimes you have very, very clear lines between admin and data, and you're a programmer or maybe you're a BA, but there is never a time where I don't need to get something from database A, do something with it, and move it to database C. And whether it's a reporting solution, whether it's to be in your data warehouse, whether it's just to be given to the BA to take that process of, we have this raw information and now we're understanding what it means to the business, and now it becomes valuable. And you want to be in that value stream. You don't want to just be the guy who says, no, don't touch that. You want to be the guy that helps get this from don't touch it place to, yes, this is yours now, figure it out. And to that end, we have to, it's to our benefit to understand the different tools we have available to us and different strategies. Sometimes you learn one way of doing things and you repeat that for the rest of your career. You don't have 10 years in, you have year 1 times 10. And regardless of how we approach this, we're going to be doing the same fundamental processes. So starting with brute force and understanding the steps that we have to do, we're going to be doing the same steps whether we're using some of these other system managed approaches. But if we understand the core concept, then we're just kind of spending our brain cycles on, this is a variation on a core concept. Instead of every new thing you learn, it just kind of takes up more and more space in our heads. So something to think about when we're just doing a brute force approach. It's brute force because it is brute force. You're going to scan every row in the table. If it's a trivial amount of data, that may not be a big thing. Once we get into the millions or tens of millions of rows, then we start to have a problem. Sometimes this is just the only option we have. This is a very real situation. If you're working in a lockdown environment, or you have a third-party application that if you touch it, you're no longer supported. And these are very real things we have to deal with. So understanding efficient ways of doing this, excuse me, and understanding what we have to do and understanding the kinds of things we have to think about, it's to our benefit. So if we're going to be comparing every column, we have to know how to handle comparing nulls. We have to know what to do if your source data is a certain correlation and your reporting database is a different correlation. So yeah, I see that. And these little bullet points are learned the hard way, and lots of hours is like, why doesn't this match? Why do I get this? Why is this update statement failing? And data types. If you're connecting to an old SQL Server 2000 database and they have text or in text or something, and you have to understand what sorts of steps you take to what's the modern supported version of the data type. And these are just things we have to know. And if we have to deal with deletes on our, let's say, our reporting database, what kinds of things do we have to think about? Because deleting 100 rows is a much different proposition from deleting 1 million rows. Or if you have a very chatty system and you have inserts and deletes and inserts and deletes, these are things that you have to put your admin hat on and understand. Sometimes we get to live in just the creative developing something, but there is a cost to every decision, there's a benefit to every decision. So the more we focus our attention on what's the cost of a certain approach, the better off we're going to be, the better conversations we're going to have with our peers, and it's just going to be, life is just better. You don't want to always be fighting and pointing fingers. And again, any questions, feel free to, to pop in, because I already feel myself talking really fast, and I guess.
Oh, you're good. You're good. You're good.
So brute force, if you're going to brute force it, you're going to be living with a few, and these patterns, I'm going to relocate a little tiny bit. These patterns, the not in, not exist, outer join, and except, these are all those different ways of doing that same chord. They're different ways of doing the same job, or doing this, getting the same thing, and it's good to know more than one. If you have a table and you're fortunate enough, it's like, hey, this is a clustered index, maybe an identity column in your source and your target, then you're going to be in a little bit better position, because you can use an index column, and you're still doing a seek or a scan, but you can be a little bit more efficient. I have from real world, very expensive applications will be in heaps, and we have to deal with that, because this is not this is not something I am allowed to touch. It doesn't matter if I'm super admin on, once it gets in house, this, even in a situation where the server is leased from a different company, so I have zero admin access to it. But there's some clever ways we can kind of get around that. So these are just some examples of the kinds of queries you're gonna be writing. If you're just comparing and looking for new rows, and you have the primary key, the unique index identified, the unique columns identified, then we can just say, give me everything that's not in where I'm already going. So from my source, select all the rows where my primary key is not in the target database. And this is kind of the trivial example of just show me the new stuff. If we have a composite key, I didn't change the query, but if you have a composite key, the not in's not going to work. So we're going to do the not exists. And we have our nice little correlated subquery, and we start to think about things of outer references. And this is another thing that's, you kind of learn, like, I remember, like, that's getting really stuck. How do I write this? I know how to do the not in, and then this not exists in this correlated subquery comes into action. And again, we do get the benefit of more efficient indexes involved. So we're not quite in full brute force, and then we're just inserting our new rows. And another variation on that is just to do an outer join, and we're looking for null columns on, I think, the left side on this example. But these are all different ways of doing the same thing, because if you can run all of these, and you look at what the query optimizer has decided to do with it, and you get the same performance, you get the same cost on terms of resources on your server. And it's really important to not only think about the cost and server time and storage, but the cognitive load, because we're creatures of fixed resources at any given time. So if you can take all those concepts that we kind of jumping back here, if you take all these concepts and ideas, and then you're able to just compress them into a single concept in your mind of, oh yeah, this is in my, does it exist in my target table already? And these are just different ways of doing that. You take these concepts that are really exploded out in our heads and taking up a lot of space and a lot of our attention, and you just compress it down to a single thing, and that frees up more space for us to hopefully tackle more interesting problems, or just probably just the next problem that's in front of us. Okay, so that is a brief overview of the brute force, and later on we'll show an example of if we're doing updates as well, and we have to compare all the columns. It's not just does it exist, has it changed. So in brute force, we're living in developer managed or DBA managed workflows. We have to know the business, we have to know the data. Is there an updated column? We're keeping track of the primary keys. There's a cognitive load on the individual, and if we can take that cognitive load and move it to something that's really good at keeping track of things like this, like a database, like a system, like a computer, That's a good trade. So we're going to look at Rowversion, which is really old. It's built in. When I found this, I couldn't believe I didn't know about it. Same thing with change tracking. It's been there a long time. It has some quirks and change data capture, which honestly is my favorite. I love it. I use it every time I can. There's lots of quirks about it. There's a lot of complications around it. It's a skill set you have to cultivate a bit, but the payoff is potentially very valuable to the organization, and it's a great thing to have in your hip pocket because it can solve a lot of problems. Temporal tables seems to be change data capture evolved, and it's really a fascinating thing. There's a few things I don't like about it, and I have not had a chance to really use it in a production situation. So, unfortunately, the way I see it, it's just sort of like kind of dreaming. It's like, oh yeah, I could do this. I can see how it's valuable. But for sure, the first three, I've used it in many situations and honestly abused it in many situations, especially change data capture. But they solved very important problems to the business. And I think sometimes we as developers and as individuals have a real problem of scale, because I think it's like, oh man, I spent 3 months figuring out how to use this thing. And if you're working for an energy company, well, they have 100 rigs out on the field, and the bill rate is 25,000 a day. So we're just, and it's a it's a company with $1 trillion market cap, or in the tens of billions of dollars involved. So your little 3-month adventure to put something into place that could potentially years later still be solving that same problem, it's a worthy investment. That's just kind of my little aside, because I think we sometimes just don't understand the value proposition of what we do. And any investment we make in what technology we learn, or approaches, or how to be better approach our job, or have better tools, mental models, they pay off in a very real and tangible way, not hopefully just for yourself career-wise, but for your employer or your client, or maybe a potential future peer, because you're able to bail someone out in a jam.
For years. Yeah, they just keep paying off for years, ideally.
Yeah, and that still blows my mind that, something that you're very proud of at the time, and he's like, oh man, I kind of pieced together this dinky mail merge, and it was Access, but it was talking to our, it hit our CRM system, and I remember this view is gross, but it did the job. And you find out that, that used to be 2 weeks of someone's job, or a week of someone's job, year after year. This was their responsibility to, hey, it's the 3rd week of the month, don't talk to so-and-so, because you know what they're doing. And that's real value. That freed up that person's time. They didn't get rid of that person. That freed up that person's time to do something else.
More valuable.
And I leave the job, and I'll have lunch with some friends, and it's like, oh yeah, we finally replaced some crappy Access database. There's a computer in the corner that no one was allowed to touch. It's like, are you kidding me? That's been running for 5 years? And kind of pat yourself on the back and realize that something that, as you progress and as you get different tools under your belt, might appear to be a little janky, but it solved the business problem. It provided value, and that's good. And so I know I'm kind of like on a philosophical tangent here.
It's true, yeah.
But that's also an important lesson of empathy. When I go on site, if I start a new project, it took far too long to learn. Nobody's going to be impressed with you by looking at someone's bad code and complaining about it. Nobody cares. And you don't know the constraints the person was up against when that was in place, or something perfectly reasonable for a 2 gigabyte database, and it could have been 2 gigabytes for years, is just not the right answer for a data warehouse project. This wasn't intended to be a data warehouse. So of course the tools in place and the solutions in place don't match. So be nice. Have empathy for someone else. Okay, so Rowversion. Rowversion is still very much in the brute force category. We're going to have to do a lot of comparing things. It doesn't help us with deletes, but what it can do is dramatically decrease the number of rows we're going to have to compare and look at. If I have a table with tens of millions of rows, and I have a way of saying, it's like, okay, the last time I look at this, the highest version was this. So I'm still going to brute force a lot of things, but my candidate rows are anything newer than this version. There's things that are not good about it, and this might be on a later slide, is if you update it to itself, if you just take a row, update it to the original value, it still increments that Rowversion counter. And I can see that as, from a technical perspective, that is probably correct. That is, something happened. The fact that the data didn't change is irrelevant to that. Oh, I've issued an update statement and I said, please change this value. That may be the correct answer, but it's not an interesting answer because I don't want to do stuff with it if it's still itself. And of course, there's I/O overhead. This is going to take up space on your storage system. This is, you're modifying a table. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. Not pictured. SQL Server replication, triggers, and third-party tools. These are these are valid approaches. They are perfectly the right answer in many, many situations. Probably not triggers. But since the title is T-SQL tools, and we're just talking about T-SQL things, some very, very good approaches are just not in the purview today. But yes, third-party tools, if you can get them, do them. Save your brain. Okay, so now we can talk about Rowversion. This is, I love it because it's system managed, it's incremental. It's not guaranteed to be unique, but we don't care. That's not what we care about. This is not a candidate for primary key. This is not a good candidate for a clustered index unless you want to just have lots of data pages moving around because you like that. It is just a thing that increments when a DML, yeah, that's it. A DML operation is fired off on a row. Nice things. You can add it to an existing table. And if it's a big table, we still have to do common sense things. Is it something that we can do in a reasonable amount of time? Do we have an outage window? Is this an always firing off heavy, highly transactional database? Do I have spurious updates going on? I learned the hard way that sometimes applications just like to say, I'm alive, updated, I'm alive, still here. Anything happened? Nope, but I'm here. And you have to know these things because that could just invalidate this as an option. So what you do get is this nice little binary value that you can know that it's going to be bigger than the last time. So a whole slew of questions can leave your brain. You don't have to worry about it. Like, what is this thing? It's bigger than the last time. If it's different, if it's changed, if it's been touched, it's bigger. So if I keep track of the last version I looked at, and I should probably store that in a table somewhere, then I can know with confidence that I don't know what happened to it. I don't know if it's been inserted or if it's been updated. I definitely don't know if it's been deleted because the row's gone, so it doesn't help us there. But I don't have to guess. I can put a nice index on that, and I can maybe brute force 100,000 rows or 10,000 rows or whatever, however active your system is, versus the big giant table. So some limitations, you only have one row version column per table, and that makes sense. I can't even imagine the value of having more than one. The value increments with each insert update operation. So any DML, it's gonna tick that counter a little bit higher. It's not guaranteed to be unique, but for our purposes, that's okay. And you kind of have to, I think you have to go out of your way to get them to be the same value, maybe a batch insert. But even if it is a batch insert, and even if it's the same, that grouping that's the same is still bigger than the last time I checked. So I do want those rows. Those need to come to me so I can look at them and figure out what to do next. Not a good idea for your primary clustered index because of that. If you update, you don't want to cluster on something that's likely to change, and this for sure will change. And a no-op is going to increment that value. So again, technically correct, but for me who's trying to get something to the data warehouse or our BAs or our report writers or whomever, this is interesting but not valuable. So any questions so far or any comments?
No, you're good. Let's see here. One person said, Steve Malcolm said, I'm going to have to watch this about 15 times.
Okay, yeah. Well, oh, man, I'm watching these all morning. It's like, oh, dude, my code samples aren't cool like that. It's like, what? So many graphics. Oh, man, I'm blowing it.
Everybody always feels bad compared to it. It was also interesting to see like 3 out of the 4 sessions so far have been on the Stack Overflow database. And I'm always like, yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. That's, I did try to like, yeah, I'm going to get the full version. It's like, I don't have 200 gig feed. It's like, I pulled like, oh, it's like 15 gig. That's pretty good. 15 compressed. And no indexes. Great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, this is great to have a common language to work with, and it's a common set of tools. Like, oh yeah, badges. I know that one. I've seen it.
Yeah, yeah.
But this does bring up an interesting point. In my example here, I've modified Stack Overflow database. In the real world, I'm probably not going to be able to do that. So I have definitely, when you're having that conversation of what sort of value can you unlock, you do things like, can we get on a call with the vendor? Can they add this for us?
Are we allowed to use this feature?
Right. I've had people come back, it's like, oh, CDC, unsupported. I don't believe you, but okay. Data type, in-text data type, well, nope, that's what we're not changing our code. It has to be in 2000 compatibility mode, we'll break it. Well, I'm on a newer server. It's like, nope, unsupported. That's a great, they love saying, you'll be unsupported configuration. And the people writing the checks go, unsupported, no, hit the brakes, pump the brakes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's enough of that. But deletes are still going to be a brute force. So if you need to find out, all right, in my source system, what has been deleted, and I'm relying on Rowversion for my inserts and updates, I'm going to say, all right, we're going to invert that not in. So what's in my target and it's not in my source. And here I have a nice little delete CTE. Really learn to batch your deletes. Have a couple of ways of approaching that, because you just don't want to fire up in these examples. My mindset is this is probably something that's going to be set up on a schedule. It's not going to be 8 a.m. and you drag the script file from your desktop and you hit the button and do something. And if you are, that's a bad place to be, and we need to get out of that because it's a better future for you. That just blindly deleting stuff, like things happen in big numbers on source systems that you don't know about. So you don't want to fill up the transaction log. You don't want to kill the reporting server because you're processing 10 million deleted rows because somebody forgot to kick off the batch delete job in the source system for months. The real stories. It's like, we got afraid, we haven't deleted for 6 months and now we're good. So we just deleted 6 months of data in the source system and now that just flows through. So just that concept of have more than one way of doing things. I think I've even seen, you experiment and you learn things. It's like, oh wow, if I order by the clustered index and I delete in batches by that, it's pretty efficient. I can churn through a lot of data very quickly that way, as opposed to just delete and let the pages kind of be grabbed as the optimizer gets them, and then you have lots of potential for blocking and bad things can happen. All right, so our Rowversion recap. It is system maintained, which is a good thing. It is unique per database, mostly. You can do things to get duplicate values there, but for keeping track of what's been modified, that is no big deal. It can help us really, we're still in brute force land, but it can give us clues on, okay, I don't have to look at this much, I only have to look at this much or this much. And it doesn't help at all with deletes. And it's gonna lie to you, because if you're trying to move data changes and it got updated to itself, it's kind of a lie. So that's it for this section. Any questions or comments or?
No, looks good. Looks good.
Okay, cool. Change tracking. This I do like this one quite a bit. So this we're moving up from like we're going to be in brute force for a long time, but this is a nice step up because this solves a couple more problems. This solves more than the Rowversion. So whenever I talk about some of these new options, I do want to make sure that we understand, unless you're the sole DBA developer, we're going to have a conversation with your admin. We're going to have a conversation with your SAN admin. We're going to have a conversation with other people who have to support your system, because every time you get clever and you're the only one that knows how to do something, that's not a good place to be. So the more you bring in, if you're going to bring in something to your organization, if you're going to bring in something to your environment, understand the pros and cons, understand the administrative concerns, and be able to explain it to your peers, or else you're going to get a call at 3 in the morning when it's not your turn to get calls at 3 in the morning. Okay, so it has to be enabled at the database level. So you can't just, as a developer, probably set this up. You're going to have to coordinate it, and you additionally have to enable change tracking at the table level. This requires elevated permissions, make sure it works in dev, figure out what needs to happen to get into production. And we do have an option, which I really do like, to track changes at the column level. So what that will unlock is a bit mask that says, okay, at this version, and you have to do some things to pull the details out, but you can say, oh, this update happened and these 2 columns changed, this 1 column changed. That lets us do things like, well, if it's just my spurious update where it's like, I'm alive, everything's fine. It's like, okay, I can ignore that. If it's something like a customer ID or things that are important, or even, not everything gets moved to the reporting database. Not everything's a candidate for the data warehouse. So if you're at that level of maturity and you have enough metadata to know this is important, this is not, you can start to winnow down the sorts of things you look at and be more efficient, more efficiently approach it. And it is a first-class citizen in SQL Server, so you get some nice built-in functions. You don't have to get too clever. You just have to learn some new syntax. But it's a very, very good middle ground. It's one of my favorite approaches because it's not as intensive as change data capture. It doesn't give you as much, but it solves enough of this problem that it's very likely, with that 80-20 rule, it's very likely going to give you a lot of value, a lot of bang for the buck, our brain bucks. So this is at the database level. If you're a developer and you can do this on the prod system, that's probably a bad thing. So you're going to have to talk to your admin. Let's talk about that retention period and cleanup behavior. I do recall, fortunately, I've never run into this, so this goes in the pile of, things I might have to look up later if it happens versus war stories. But I do recall, I think Kendra had a blog post about a very active system, and the cleanup process wasn't happening fast enough, so the database had a lot of bloat to it. And there's no supported official way to do, like, to just get the cleanup going the way you need it. And there's some kind of like, okay, some somebody, I don't know, however you get these secret stored procedures or secret things from
Right.
Microsoft. It's like, okay, run these and it'll do you. But that's something to keep in mind. So this is just part of that. When you're bringing in something that solves a problem, these are things you have to be aware of, and these are things that you're going to have a strategy in place to deal with. I know with change data capture, if things get crossed up, disable change data capture. Boom, all my stuff is gone. Re-enable it, rebuild it. So that brute force is a great thing to understand, because the brute force is always your reset button. That's your get out of jail. That's your get out of jail card. So it's really good for you to know things like, oh, when things are great, it takes an hour to figure out all the changes and move them across. If I have to scan the table, we technically have an outage because we won't have reports for a day or two. But you're not going to, those are things you have to set expectations up front. People, they'll be upset with bad news, but it's even worse if you just don't tell them or you try to hide it or you just don't know. It's like, how long does it take to do? I don't know. Good question. Let's find out. You don't want to be there. But it's great to know that regardless of what more refined approach you have, brute force, you have it solved. You can always hit that button and get back up and running. Retention period it's important to keep track of. If you have a job that needs to move data and it's been down for 3 days and your cleanup period's 2 days, well, guess what? You're gonna have to hit your reset button. So understand these things, make conscious decisions about it, and make conscious decisions that are appropriate to environment. If it's a system that has moderate activity and you have plenty of storage space and there are plenty of resources and you just want to be super, super graceful to yourself, 5 days. You have lots of opportunities to find a problem and your data's still there. If you're really tightly constrained and you're kind of squeezing things in, maybe that 1 day period is going to be, or if it's just a very active database and you don't want all this metadata just stacking up and stacking up, you make those informed decisions. And I really do like this option for the tracking changes at the column level, because that is interesting information. That's valuable information. Some data is more important than others. Some updates are spurious. Some updates are interesting but not important. And if you have a way of filtering those out, that's a good thing. That's a nice thing to have. So this is what you get: a new system function when you enable change tracking. You get a nice change table. You pass in the table name. You pass in the row version, and what you get back is all the change that happened since our last thing. So you'll see a theme is like keeping track of the last time you checked something. That's what you want to do, whether it's a table. It's a table. Spoiler alert, it's a table. Get your logging in place. Have an approach. Don't shoot from the hip. Don't make it up every time. Just pick a model and stick with it. And once you have it kind of rolling, it should be kind of a big deal to change. That should fall into the bucket of that's a solved problem for me. If I needed to back up a database and I don't have light speed, it's okay. It's a solved problem for me. If I have to keep track of what changes, it's okay. It's a solved problem for me because I just have my little tracking table and I'm good. So this is great. You have the sys change operation. So these are in my little output from this table function, the change operation, the change columns, and the version. So I have insert, update, deletes. If I care about inserts, maybe that's one workflow. If I have updates, and that's a different workflow, and like you can split out your workflows, you can make informed decisions based on what happened to your source system. Your sys change columns, it's a var binary, it's a bit mask. I don't believe I have an example in there. I can probably follow up, but it's one of those things where like, oh yeah, you learn how to do it, and then you just put it in your scripts. Yeah, that becomes another one of your solved problems. Like, what changed? Cool. I This is important, do this. This is not important, let it go. And very common things like if you're not used to working with table functions, you might forget to alias it, then you get really weird errors. So these are just, you're bringing potentially new things into your workflow. These are new things that have to go in your head. And that's just a reminder, oh, because I've definitely done that where like, why is this working? Why am I getting an error? It's like just the dumb stuff. Alias it because, you know, SQL Server doesn't know what you're trying to do otherwise. Oh yeah, so that's just, so what we have here is just kind of an example of, we get our, just lots of extra information. So I'm looking at something that changed. I see I have a delete, I have an insert, I have an update, and my update is that bit mask, and I can turn that into a column list. I can turn that into a targeted insert or update or delete statement. And I really like being able to target my updates. If I'm in a situation where, and this is real, this is not the best place to be, but this is a real place I've been. It's like I'm moving stuff over a linked server. So, if I can just send the 3 columns I care about over to that linked server, and I don't have, you know, a dual active 40 gigabyte per second. I don't, strangely enough, I don't always have that. That's not guaranteed to exist for me. So having things like targeted updates. If I do have 40 gigs a second active, I'm probably doing things like, oh, just restore the whole database over there. Like send it all. Let's, that's not the case though. I very rarely have that sort of excess of resources available to me. So change tracking recap, great. Doesn't require Enterprise Edition. You already have access to it. You can do it now. You can do it today in depth. You do have additional storage overhead. So anything we do is going to have an administrative, not cost, but an administrative concern. If something goes wrong, I know that there is a bug, and if you had an unexpected restart, well, you have bigger problems. But one of the things is you can't trust that change tracking data to have everything. You could lose changes. So your system that tells you what has been modified can lie to you. And so you have to know that that's a thing that's possible, and you have to know that, oh, we did have that, we had a restart that we weren't expecting. That means I have to hit my reset button and do the brute force approach again. But if you didn't know that that was even a possibility, your reporting system may be lying to you. And any new things, like, all right, I gotta look it up. Are there KB articles? Are there bug reports? Are there blog posts? It's just there's an ongoing concern of keeping up to date of the pros and cons of what you've brought in. Change data capture. Again, just gonna pause how are we looking good on questions?
Good. No, you're
Okay.
good. You're good.
Cool.
Oh, alleged DBA points out, he said enterprise, or he calls it expensive edition is required for CDC for 2016 until you get to Service Pack 1.
Yes. So up until Service Pack 1, change data capture was always a big meeting. It was a big presentation. Since Service Pack 1, this is, a medium-sized meeting, maybe the manager instead of a director. I still remember change data capture. It was like, I want to do this, and then fortunately, it was the sole system that actually did have Enterprise Edition. But yeah, that's a hard sell. That is a real hard sell if you don't already have it in place. But if you're in a position where you're in SP1, 2016 SP1 or higher, or if it's your previous version that has Enterprise Edition, this is a great option. You can have 2 capture instances. So whenever you enable this feature on a table, it creates what's called a capture instance. And you can grab all the columns, you can grab a subset of columns, and you can get the before and after values, which is really great for auditing solutions. It can be great for, this is a really important configuration and somebody's somebody did something they weren't supposed to, and I know exactly what it was right before, because true story, this is a configuration in the ERP system, and that changes how we value things in the warehouse. And those are very, very, very important configurations that have very real and expensive consequences. So knowing what it was before, so you can rectify the situation and get that, get your depreciation or get whatever reprocessed quickly, that's a good thing to have. And whenever, if you as the DBA or the developer or the data steward can say, oh yes, it was this, it was changed by this on this date. Unfortunately, without some out of the box, we're not going to get who did the change. So it only tracks the actual DML, the data changes. It does not add any like system level, like your S user or anything like that. I've tried to get cute and keep do a database audit at the same time, and correlate timestamps. But now I probably just use the who is active trick and just log those and say, based on the evidence between change to capture and who is active and the host name that this came from, it was probably this person. So lots of flexibility. I see that as a pro. This is a great thing, and lots of flexibility. It's also a con, because you can do silly things, or you have to spend potentially a lot of mental energy deciding what you want out of it or how you want to approach it. So this is what we've talked about so far. This, I feel, has the biggest potential benefit, but also the biggest cognitive and administrative load so far. A couple of notes on best practices. A separate file group is recommended for the change data capture instance. There is additional I/O overhead, and if you have things like tiered storage, sometimes we're in a situation where you get the SAN admin just hands you a slice of storage for your database. Sometimes we have that tier 0, tier 1, tier 2 storage, and we definitely want to make sure that the CDC data lives in a place that's appropriate for the I/O patterns. We're going to get a lot of append-only inserts and just these delete jobs that run as the data ages out. Once we enable it, we have some SQL Server agent jobs. So these are things we need to keep track of. And we do want to keep track of, the great benefit is you can read from your CDC files, so you're not impacting your OLTP system as heavily. So your OLTP system can be happily just doing whatever it needs to do, and you're reading data from a separate file group, maybe even a separate set of spinning disks or a separate LUN, and you can hit that data without dragging down your online system. And you do want to make sure that you understand what role has access to the tracked data. So if you have tables that have sensitive information, whether it's payroll information, or if you have a PHI, that don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to sidestep your own security policies in your source table because you have secure information that's being replicated into your CDC tables, and anyone who is a CDC admin can read that data. So that's a concern that you'll have to keep track of, is if you have a gating role in the database, is that person getting elevated permissions to data that they otherwise would not have access to? And
I never thought of that.
oh yeah, that's a big one. And if you're going to restore your database for testing or development or whatever, you have a nice new keyword in your with is keep CDC, because that happens, and if you don't know that, you can have a real bad morning because people think things are gone when they're not. So just some things to keep track of with CDC. There's some great reading time ahead of you if you decide to take this, because you get all sorts of brand new functions to learn and think about and understand which ones are important to your life and which ones aren't. you have lots and lots of options for your cleanup job and how you read the transaction log. And unless you're in a very high throughput environment or a specialized situation, fortunately, you can kind of settle on some sensible defaults early on and not have to turn too many knobs. But you will have to understand your environment and understand the I/O patterns and make sure things like your log reader job doesn't fail to start up, or somebody stopped it because they didn't know what it is, or deleted it because they didn't know what it is. So hopefully you're talking to people in your environment so they know what it is. But yes, these are these are all links that on my computer are a different color.
Wow.
And are functions. So these are our stored procedures. These will start it, stop the jobs, create your capture instances, and these are all the things you have to think about. And it's really funny to watch the different solutions that have been introduced in different times. Rowversion has a function in its own special way of saying between this and this. And then you get to change it to capture, and it has its own special way of saying between this and this. And we get to temporal tables, it's like another new special way of saying between this and this. So it's kind of a mental exercise to always
Context
really
switch.
or I see it as really taking the time to pin your mental energy to the core concept. And now you're just kind of learning, oh, this is a variation of core concept between this and this. So that's firm in my mind. And then it's like, oh yeah, this is how they call it. It's a compression for your mental energy. So yeah, we have, there's no really cool GUI. So you're gonna be writing some SQL and making more decisions. This is the cost of it. But again, pretty early on, if you understand the environment, you can settle on some defaults, settle on some patterns. This represents kind of my go-to. You got to pass in the schema, the badges, you give it a role name, CDC admin. That's just out of habit. There's no special way. I think that was just an example in Books Online when I learned it, and I didn't see it. I was like, okay, CDC admin tells me everything I need to know. But that whoever's in that role, whoever has access to that role, has access to every bit of data in any tracked system. But now that I think about it, this is not a necessarily role name for CDC across the board. It was because that's how I set it up. But if you do have PHI, I'm sure you can do CDC PHI admin or Gary, and only Gary's allowed to look at this, or however you want to roll that. So that's something to put in consideration when if you do have financial data or PHI or things that are very locked down, that you could potentially just have different gating roles per domain of data. So sometimes just how you might lock down data by schema, you could take a similar approach here in your change tracking or change it to capture. But again, that is, we don't get out of understanding our environment, understanding the data that's involved, understanding the value of data, because you do want to be in that value conversation. And being in that value conversation means I don't just get to look at the bits and the cool tech. I understand what the data means to the business, and I understand what happens if data goes where it ought not. So come up with a naming scheme for your capture instances. This support net changes, I typically don't enable that because a lot of times when I'm using that, I do want the intermediate values. I want to know if something changed from this to this to this. If you do support net changes, I think you just get some extra indexes, and you can say, okay, I don't care how many times it changes, but as of 5 p.m. yesterday, what did it look like? And the captured column list, this is important. Don't default to grabbing everything. Make informed decisions about what you want. And I keep going back to the example of the spurious updates, because that's a very real thing where you have, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive. Something changed? No, I'm alive, I'm alive, everything's okay. and I might need to know that. So I would create 2 capture instances, one that is just the I'm alive column, and then the other ones are the rest is, okay, these are important for reporting in the business or whatever else I'm doing with this. And do name your file group. So when you create your capture, or when you enable change data capture, create a new file group, call it CDC. If you can, put it on a different LUN, different storage, faster storage better. So if you have that tier 1, tier 0, because you're gonna have lots of writes and deletes, it's gonna be append only, because it's just like something changed, insert, 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 insert. That's what happens, it inserts, keeps going. So if you, knowing that the IO patterns are potentially very different from your LTP system, you might make those decisions accordingly, and you're going to have, well, you don't have to, but it's in your benefit to have a conversation with your SAN admin, unless you're just in one of those all flash storage places, and doesn't matter, I guess.
Yeah, money's not an object.
Right. So they are, same thing. You have to know what your index is. It has to be, you have to tell the capture instance what uniquely identifies your row. If you don't know that, you have bigger problems. Solve those problems, then look at this stuff. Monitor the rate of change. Again, if you have the spurious updates, you're gonna get a lot of IO. You could run out of space, and that's not a good thing.
Jody
Yes.
asks, while you're on CDC, does the captured column list for CDC levy any restrictions on schema changes being made to the table you're monitoring?
Okay, I think if you drop a column, I don't recall offhand if the DDL fails or if it breaks your capture instance. If you add columns, cool, it just doesn't get tracked. You have to add that. One of the system tables does keep track of any DDL on a track table. So if in the past where ERP systems, somebody can go and make a change and they hit save, and that will add a column or change a column. So without any database DB admin intervention, I have changes to a table that can happen in the normal course of business.
Mhm.
So I had very lofty dreams. I was like, yeah, man, I'm gonna read that DDL. I'm gonna just replicate the change on the
Automatically
fly
generate.
and maybe send an email that it did it. So I, just like know what's going on. No, but I can for sure have an alert fire. I was like, hey, by the way, this happened. Go do something.
Get a human involved.
Yes. So if you do write that piece, that's all awesome. Post it.
Open
Sure.
source it. Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like we're running short on time, so I'll try to catch up. So this is something you look at. Any capture instance, the system automatically creates these tables for you. You get lots of new metadata, and you have your start LSN, your log sequence number, your end, your seq val, which is great to know that that's unique and the LSN is not, and you can spend a lot of time having updates not work the way you think they should because you don't know that LSN is not unique, but seq val is. You have your operation that tells you, was this an insert? Was this an update? Update with the before value and an update with the after value. You have your update mask that can say, okay, for this operation that happened, these are the columns that were modified. And then you actually have a copy of the column. So the way change data capture works is if you update a single column, the entire row gets logged into your log table. So that's why I say it's important to understand the IO patterns. It's important to understand the frequency of change on the columns, and it's important to understand how big a row we're talking every time something changes. Like a very small value can change, but we're logging 40 columns every single time. That's a different conversation when you have, 2 values that change and you're logging 5 columns. And this command ID, it's new. I've not needed it. I think it's really cool. But it does let you know things that happen in a single transaction. So if it's important to replicate a transaction as a transaction, you have the raw ingredients to do so. And again, this is just over and over again, what happened between this and this? We have a new way of learning. It's like, oh, all updates old. These are just things that you're going to have to learn, but once you have that core concept of here's my upper boundary, here's my lower boundary, something happened between it, and don't make silly errors like off by ones. Like, is my upper boundary less than or less than and equal to? Is my lower boundary greater than or equal? You know, I mean, those things can trip you up because now I have a new way of calling it. All updates old. What does that mean? That's not a database thing. Who writes these things? But you have to understand what all updates old versus all updates mean, because those are two different things.
Rock, paper, scissors kind of thing.
Yeah. But that's, again, establishing patterns and sensible defaults. Those are your friends. Have a pattern, write it down, and keep it, because the learning curve is high. But now if I need to change it to capture, I have my scripts. I know what it's going to be named. I have my, I have the behavior nailed down. It went from a very difficult thing with high payout to a very easy thing with high payout. And the really nice thing is we have some functions that you can translate that LSN to an actual date. So it becomes really easy to say, all right, every change before 5 o'clock, or every change between business hours, every change before yesterday at 2, whatever you want to do. These are great things. Oh, and just an example of seeing how that LSN number gets translated to a date time. Because if you're reporting on something and something's important enough to move from your OLTP system to a data warehouse, probably, or the context of when something happened may be important. So that's good extra information that you can make smart decisions based on. And we do get this great level of information where I can say process separately, give me all the primary keys for things that are deleted, show me all the inserts. I want to see the old value before it changed because we're going to audit, we're going to log it, we're going to do something with it, or we need to fix it because they weren't supposed to do that. And you have your new value. So you have new things to monitor. When you create when you enable change to capture on the database, and these don't get created until you do it on the table, I believe, is you have some new SQL Server agent jobs. You will want to make sure that they start, that they're running, and that they don't stop. And for whatever reason, you're not monitoring that, you don't notice. And that's a bad thing, because if your capture job is not running, your transaction log is going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. If your cleanup job is not running, your CDC tables are going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And if you have a very busy system, and it could be that that's the driving force behind it, because that's why I initially had to actually use this or learn this, is because of an incredibly busy system. So I couldn't query the online tables because dashboards would stop working, and very important dashboards that people looked at all the time would stop working. So we set up this CDC, and we're talking, it was ridiculous. It was just maybe not in absolute terms with all the compute power we have today, but in relative terms of what we had available to us, we're pushing at maximum. So it was incredibly useful to be able to split the IO load, and I can just, however often I want, grab that data from the CDC tables and then ship it down to our BI guys or whatever was needed for it. So our recap for change to capture, you're going to have additional IO overhead. There's more things to learn. There's more things to administer. And it's very flexible, which can be a pro, and it's very flexible, which should be a con. And if you have SQL Server 2016 SP1 Standard Edition, it's available to you. So by all means, take the chance to explore it and see if it's going to work for you. How are we on time? Do we need to?
Got about 10 minutes left.
Oh, okay, good. Temporal tables. This is the newest thing for me. So from my perspective, this looks like change data capture evolved. This has all the niceness that we have in change data capture, but the system does it for you. So when you enable a temporal table, or when you enable this for a table, the archive table automatically gets created for you. I don't have to go through the extra effort of creating a new table, grabbing that data, landing it, getting my ETL written. It just is there. It's beautiful. How that translates to storage overhead or where that data is written, I'll be honest, I don't know. I know when I do CDC, I'll change the default file group and then enable the feature, so all the system tables are not in my data or where my data lives, my OTP data lives. And so exploring this, that would probably be the first thing I do is like, okay, where does this live? Because just because in SSMS, it's like, ooh, a secret thing. It's like, no, it's still a table somewhere. It's, you don't, I think sometimes the visual metaphor we see with the little folders and the plus sign and these things separates us from like, oh, this is how it lives in the file system. This is how it's represented on our servers. And more new syntax. So the great thing with this, and this I really do love it, is right here at the bottom, you can specify this name, but the valid from and valid to. So now for each row in a tracked table, you not only have, oh, this changed in the table itself, and you can use these in your queries, this was the value between this date and that date. So you have as of, what did the data look like as of yesterday afternoon? What did it look like at 2 o'clock because something went wrong at 2:01? Or you get your slowly changing dimensions for free. That's incredibly powerful. This also has the thing I really don't like is a no op will get me a new entry. So I consider updating a table to the original values a no op. Nothing actually changed. So the server says, yes, I processed your DML statement. Check. And you look at the data, it didn't change. So that if you're using this to make decisions to feed it to a data warehouse, or it is your data warehouse, that's something to keep in mind, that you might have to do a distinct, or I don't know. These are the little subtle errors that can creep in if you don't really understand all the systems and you're not actively thinking about what can go wrong, what can violate my expectations. Are my core assumptions that it's only going to change if something actually changes incorrect? And you have to check that, because you're bringing in new tools that satisfy different problems, but they have their own quirks and their own things to know. And so back in our mental model of core concepts, I know I have to understand between these 2 points in time, or points in record, or versions, or whatever, between these 2 points, what happened and what sorts of things can tick off that something happened counter. The thing I really love about CDC is, from my point of view, it behaves correctly with that no op. So for the problem that I'm trying to solve, just what actually changed, if I update it to itself, I don't get a new entry in my CDC tables, only if something actually changes. So that's the only reason I kind of still keep that at the top of the stack, even though temporal tables, just from what I've seen and kind of played with so far, look pretty amazing. And I definitely want to find ways to incorporate them, because I think they solve a lot of problems, especially around your data analytics, data warehouse type workflows. And you get a whole new way of doing the greater than, less than, before, between. Everyone has their own spin. I wish someone should have a single PowerPoint slide and share it between these. Yeah. But again, the trick is, okay, how do I map this to my core concept? And now I just keep track of variations, little twists on things. So I don't think of these as separate domains. There's like, oh, no, what happened between these two things? Is it greater than or equal to? Like I have my hard-learned boundary lessons, a long history of off by one errors. So by this point, it's like, okay, this is the same as between. This is the same as this, and it kind of helps the mental map. Okay, and very quickly, combining these things. Everything except for change data capture, I would say that there's some sort of brute force potentially involved. And I haven't put temporal tables in that because knowing that I can have no ops that will give me, if I'm doing counts or sums or whatever, I have to know that behavior, so there's going to be an extra overhead. Very real world stories. Source system, third party, not allowed to touch it, and it's on a server that's in a different, outside of our data center. But the connection to copy files is actually, it's faster than our link server. So I had better performance by getting it back up to the database, piping it over to our server, restoring that, and then I just like brute force it. You can combine that if you can get someone to enable change tracking. That's a fightable one. That's a winnable one. Just enable this at the table level, and then you get your backup. Be smart. Restore on Sunday. Restore the full. Have them ship differentials. It does work faster. Restore it. Stand by. It's great. I'm using this in a project right now, and the weekly restore, it takes 3 hours, but the daily work is about a gig of changes, and that's 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So in 15 minutes, I can have just those days changes, and I can like kind of take the brute force hammer and chip away at it. And if you restore your database and switch, so let's say you're just doing the full restore, it's faster to actually copy. This does happen, that it's faster to just copy and restore an entire database than to try to do a link server or a really cruddy connection to a different data center. You can restore it as a read-only database, then you will never have locks. So fire up as many queries as you want at the same time, and hopefully you are doing things like parallelizing your workload and having concurrent, like figuring out a way to concurrently run things, if that's being clever with multiple jobs, or you're being smart with SSIS. Don't just have one T-SQL script that says 1, 2.
Select from.
Yep, I've seen that. So these are things that you can combine, because it's very common to, the connection to your database is so crappy that it's faster to back it up, restore it, and do your ETL stuff. And that is it for the demo, or the presentation. I do have a couple of scripts, but I think we're pretty tight on time.
Yeah, no, we're perfect. We got enough time for questions here. Steve asks, are there any size limitations for temporal tables, like dimensional tables versus fact tables?
Oh, I don't know. I've done some coding samples with this. I've not run it in a production workload, so I've never been in a situation where that's happened. So that, just because it's the system table, it's going to be written wherever your primary or your default file group is, if it behaves the way other system managed tables behave. So that's based on how much storage available. So I don't know if there's an inherent limit on the feature itself, but definitely we still have to keep track of what our system can handle. And if it is the option, that's something that occurs to me as I'm talking to explore specifically, is, man, if I can just create a new file group and then enable these features, does it write all those to my separate file group? And then I can have my conversation with my SAN admin, say, okay, please, maybe this isn't tier 1 storage, but can I get a bucket of the quote unquote cheaper stuff?
El cheapo.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, good job. Thanks a lot, Martin. That was very cool. And it's interesting, too, to see as you go through all the features, I'm like, oh, with every one of these, I know there was a real world story about here's how I learned this, here's where I found this useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Change data capture is my favorite, because that, for about a year, that unlocked a lot of long-term problems the business had. And that was a learning experience for me professionally, because the conversation around the technology went nowhere, because that's not the audience. It's not their job to be impressed with cool stuff. It's like, it's a read ahead, it's reading the transaction log, and you have a write ahead system. Like, nobody cares. But if you can go through and it's like, hey, I want to make a deep intrinsic change to our most critical system, and here's why. Because that's what they hear. Hey, I want to touch our most important and rickety system, and I want to make a deep change to it.
Yeah.
But it was great to understand that pinning the change and pinning the risk to a mappable dollar amount, it's important to understand. And once we're able to communicate, say, hey, listen, see, all this bucket of problems can be solved like this. So the risk is high. Definitely had some late nights. It was a painful transition process, but it got us through about a six month to a year transition process where they were trying to retire their old system, and they brought in consultants. We had a bunch of people building a new system, but we were able to have a very stable transition period using this. And there's another really cool auditing solution. I did some like dynamically generated metadata driven queries. So if we enable change tracking out, it would just automatically build all the audit tables and do everything. So the programming curve was high, but the cognitive load to implement from there on was zero. And that was a great trade. It's like, hey, I'm going to be in a cave for about a month because I'm learning this stuff. But now anytime we say, oh, I need to audit this, this is a solved problem. We paid for it once, and now it's free to use. So those are the kinds of things. It comes from real world, and it's very exciting, and it's useful for a long time. So that's my website. I do lots of things that are not just technology related. And any questions, comments, I'd love to hear from you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Martin. Excellent job there. Nicely done. Nicely done.